For years, Officer Naomi Carter had endured more than just the dangers of the streets. She faced a different kind of threat within the walls of her own precinct. The looks, the whispers, the jokes disguised as advice. It was never about her ability to serve. It was about who she was. A black woman. A woman they said didn't fit the uniform. The worst of them weren't just cruel. They were predators hiding behind badges. They mocked her weight, made crude remarks about her body, and pushed boundaries that should never be crossed. Naomi knew the rules. If she spoke up, she could lose everything. But when the abuse turned into something worse, when they cornered her, laughing as if she was powerless, they forgot one thing. Naomi Carter wasn't just a woman in uniform, she was a fighter, and tonight they were about to learn exactly what that meant. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. Chapter 1. The first crack in the armor. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed faintly, casting a cold, artificial glow over the cluttered desks and scuffed tile floors. It was another long shift, another day of keeping her head down while the walls seemed to close in tighter around her. Officer Naomi Carter knew the game well. Stay quiet, do your job, and never, ever give them a reason to turn their eyes on you. But the problem was they already had. From the moment she joined the force, she had been an easy target. She wasn't like the others, her frame larger, her presence softer, her patience greater. And in a world where strength was measured by muscle and aggression, they saw her as weak. "Move it, Carter, this isn't a damn bakery," one of the senior officers, Detective Reynolds, sneered as she walked past the break room, where he and a few others sat nursing their coffee. She ignored it, like always. Reynolds wasn't the worst of them, but he was one of the loudest. The real danger lurked behind the ones who didn't just make fun of her, those who looked at her like she was something to be toyed with, something they could push and pull for their own amusement. And one of them was Lieutenant Garrison. Garrison was a hulking figure, the kind of man who filled every room he walked into with an oppressive presence. He didn't just insult her, he got close. Too close. He lingered when he talked to her, his eyes always dipping lower than they should, his breath too warm against her skin. "You know, Carter," he murmured one night after a late shift, leaning against her squad car as she gathered her things, "I could show you how to really get in shape. One-on-one training, no distractions." She forced a polite chuckle, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag. "I think I'm good, Lieutenant." His smile widened. "No need to be shy. You spend enough time with us, you might even lose a few pounds." That was how it always was. The jabs at her weight, the humiliating remarks wrapped in something that could be passed off as a joke. She swallowed the lump in her throat and climbed into her car, driving home in silence. But inside her, something was shifting. The incident that changed everything. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday night. Naomi was working in the precinct gym, finishing up her usual training routine. She wasn't like the others who lived for lifting weights or pounding out miles on the treadmill. She focused on practical strength, endurance, the kind of conditioning that would keep her alive in the field. The gym was mostly empty, except for a handful of officers, including Sergeant Miller, a man who had never missed an opportunity to belittle her. "Hey, Carter, you sure you want to be using that machine?" he called out as she adjusted the pull-down bar. "Might snap under the weight." Laughter rippled through the room, but Naomi ignored it, gripping the bar tightly. "You should stick to the treadmill," another officer added. "Work off some of that baggage." She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge them. Then Miller did something different. He walked over. "Here, let me help you out." He reached out, his hand brushing against her waist, too familiar, too deliberate. A chill ran down her spine. She turned sharply, but he was already laughing, backing away like it was all just a joke. The others chuckled too, as if it was all harmless fun. But it wasn't. And that was the moment something inside her cracked. That was the moment Naomi Carter decided she wasn't going to take it anymore. But she wasn't going to yell. She wasn't going to make a scene. No, she was going to play the long game. The first trap. The next day, Naomi arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. She had spent the night thinking, planning, and now it was time to start setting things into motion. Sergeant Miller was in the gym again, as she expected. He loved to show off, always bragging about his superior strength, the way he could bench more than anyone else. He had no idea she was watching. As he set up the barbell for his usual bench press routine, Naomi casually walked by, eyeing the weights. She noticed something. He was careless when re-racking them. Always in a rush, always assuming nothing could go wrong. She didn't need to do much, just a slight misplacement, just enough to make one side unbalanced. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to create a problem when the bar was fully loaded. And when Miller got under that bar, smug and overconfident, he didn't even notice the shift until it was too late. He unracked the weight, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. Then, as he pushed up, the imbalance threw off his control. The bar wobbled. His grip faltered, and with a sickening thud, the weight came crashing down right onto his chest. The room erupted into chaos. Officers rushed to help, struggling to lift the bar off him. His face was red, not just from the weight, but from the sheer humiliation of it all. Naomi stood in the corner watching, not smiling, not laughing, just waiting. One down. More to go. A pattern emerges. Over the next few weeks, the mood at the precinct began to shift. The teasing didn't stop completely, but it wasn't as constant. The ones who used to laugh the loudest were suddenly quieter, as if something was unsettling them, because strange things were happening. Detective Reynolds, the same one who always had a snide remark about her weight, found himself in an embarrassing situation when he tripped over his own shoelace, except Naomi knew it hadn't been untied when she walked past his desk. Lieutenant Garrison, the one who always pressed too close, mysteriously had his uniform pants ripped at the seams in the middle of briefing. No one knew how it happened, but Naomi had seen the weakened stitching the day before. And then there was the shooting range incident. During a routine training session, officers took turns practicing with their service weapons. Naomi watched as one of her biggest tormentors, Officer Daniels, stepped up. She knew Daniels had a habit. He always kept his personal weapon on the table beside his issued one. She also knew that, if positioned just right, he wouldn't notice if the guns were switched. And when he fired, expecting the usual recoil, he got something much stronger. A gunpowder-loaded surprise that sent him stumbling backward, nearly dropping the weapon altogether. He never looked at her, but she knew he was thinking about it. They all were. The question wasn't whether these incidents were connected. The question was who was doing it. Naomi kept her head down, kept doing her job, but she could feel it. The way the balance of power was shifting, how their eyes lingered a little longer, filled with uncertainty instead of mockery. For the first time since she joined the force, Naomi wasn't just a target anymore. She was something they feared, and she wasn't done yet. Chapter 2. Striking in the shadows. The precinct was different now. Naomi could feel it in the air. The same officers who used to hurl insults at her now spoke in hushed tones, their laughter more cautious, their glances uneasy. No one could prove anything, but the fear was there. And fear was a powerful tool. It had taken years for them to break her down, to turn her into their personal punching bag. But now she was methodically dismantling their confidence piece by piece. And the best part? None of them saw it coming. The next move. One evening during a late shift, Naomi sat alone in the squad room, quietly cleaning her service weapon. She had spent years perfecting this ritual, checking every part, making sure everything was in place. Across the room, Sergeant Miller sat nursing his bruised ego after his gym incident. His arm was still sore, his pride even more so. His eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment, then quickly away. He was afraid. Good. But he wasn't the only one she had unfinished business with. Lieutenant Garrison had always been the worst of them, the one who didn't just mock but touched, invaded, threatened with his presence. The weight of his hand on her shoulder, the way his fingers would linger just a little too long, the sick amusement in his eyes. Naomi remembered every single time. She had tolerated it, endured it. Now it was his turn. The training session. Every month, the precinct held mandatory hand-to-hand combat training. It was supposed to be a way to keep officers sharp, to make sure everyone could hold their own in a fight. But for men like Garrison, it was something else entirely. He loved using these sessions as an excuse to push boundaries, to demonstrate techniques in a way that left women officers uncomfortable, breathless, and bruised. Naomi had watched it happen to others, and she had been through it herself. But today would be different. The moment the session started, Naomi knew she was being set up. "Pair up," the instructor called. Garrison's smirk was already forming before he even stepped toward her. "Carter," he said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "Let's see what you've got." She nodded, playing her part, acting hesitant. She knew the others were watching, expecting a show. He always picked women who wouldn't fight back, who would let him overpower them and then laugh it off. But Naomi had been training, quietly, patiently, waiting for this exact moment. Garrison wasted no time. He moved fast, too fast for someone who expected an easy victory. His hands went straight for her waist, pretending to be demonstrating a hold, but really just using the moment to feel her up. That was his first mistake. The second was underestimating her. The second his grip tightened, Naomi exploded into action. She moved fluidly, faster than he expected, shifting her weight and twisting out of his hold. Before he could react, she was behind him, locking her arm around his thick neck. Gasps echoed through the training room. She applied just enough pressure to cut his air off, enough to make his eyes widen, his body struggle. But she wasn't done. With a calculated shift, she swept his legs out from under him. The sound of his body hitting the mat sent a ripple through the crowd. For the first time, he wasn't in control. She was. Naomi leaned in just close enough for only him to hear. "You ever put your hands on me again?" she whispered, tightening her grip slightly. "And I promise you won't be getting up next time." She released him, stepping back as he gasped for air, his face red with fury and humiliation. No one laughed. No one said a word. Because for the first time they realized Naomi Carter was not someone to mess with. Just the night shift incident. It had been a long time since Naomi had felt this kind of clarity, this kind of control. But the game wasn't over yet. One by one, she was taking them down in ways they couldn't even process. And Officer Daniels was next. Daniels was different from Garrison. He wasn't just cruel, he was dangerous. She had seen the way he talked about women when he thought no one was listening, how he bragged about what he could get away with, the way he looked at her, like he was waiting for the perfect moment. She knew that moment was coming, and she was ready. The opportunity presented itself during a late patrol. Naomi had been paired with Daniels, sent out to respond to a domestic disturbance in a quiet neighborhood. A simple call, one that shouldn't have taken more than 20 minutes. But Naomi knew what he was planning. The way he smirked when he realized they were alone, the way he took his time locking the car when they arrived. "Just you and me tonight, Carter," he said, his voice thick with something dark. "No backup, no one to interrupt us." She forced a small smile, playing along. He thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't. As they approached the house, Naomi positioned herself behind him, pretending to check her radio. And then, a gunshot. Not from their side. Daniels reacted instantly, ducking, drawing his weapon, searching for the source of the shot. And in that moment of chaos, Naomi made her move. She took out her own personal firearm, the one she had kept hidden, the one with no connection to her issued weapon. And she fired, one shot, clean, precise, right into Daniels' leg. He screamed, dropping to the ground, clutching his wound. The confusion, the panic, it all happened too fast for him to process. "Sniper!" Naomi yelled, her voice carrying through the radio. "Officer down, we need backup now." Within seconds, sirens filled the air, officers rushing to the scene. Daniels, still groaning on the ground, looked up at her, his face pale. "You," he gasped, realization dawning on him. But Naomi just stared down at him, her expression unreadable. "You should have been more careful, Daniels," she said, just loud enough for him to hear. And as the others swarmed in, she stepped back, letting them take over, letting the chaos unfold exactly as she had planned. Because now, Daniels was out, and no one would ever suspect a thing. The shift in power. Back at the precinct, the whispers had grown louder. The fear was real now. First Miller, then Reynolds, then Garrison, and now Daniels. No one knew how, but things kept going wrong for the ones who had tormented Naomi. And for the first time, the jokes stopped. No one pushed her, no one mocked her weight, no one tried to touch her. They were afraid. And that was exactly what she wanted. But she wasn't done. Not yet, because some lessons needed to be permanent. And the final act was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Trap Tightens. The precinct had turned into a house of whispers, every corner echoing with hushed conversations and suspicious glances. Naomi's presence had transformed from a target of ridicule into an enigmatic force that everyone seemed wary of. They couldn't prove anything, but the string of incidents had been too precise, too timely to be pure coincidence. She could feel their unease, their paranoia growing by the day. It was exactly what she wanted. Setting the stage. Lieutenant Garrison was still limping from the humiliation he'd suffered in the training room. Officer Daniels was out on medical leave, his leg injury conveniently coinciding with rumors of a sniper who'd yet to be identified. And Sergeant Miller, he refused to even look in Naomi's direction anymore, keeping his distance at all costs. But there were still a few left who hadn't learned their lesson, and Naomi was nothing if not thorough. One afternoon, during a shift change, Naomi found herself in the locker room, lacing up her boots. The room was mostly empty, save for Officer Rourke and Corporal Hayes, two men who had consistently made her life hell. Rourke leaned against the lockers, his voice loud and taunting. "So, Carter," he sneered, "you taking acting lessons now? Because you've been putting on quite the show lately." Hayes laughed, adding, "Maybe she's auditioning for some kind of crime drama, playing the helpless victim, huh, Carter?" Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she calmly finished tying her boots and stood, her gaze meeting Rourke's with a calm intensity that silenced him mid-laugh. "Something funny?" she asked, her tone icy yet composed. Rourke faltered for a moment, but quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "Just saying you've been real lucky lately, but luck runs out." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're right," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Luck does run out." And with that, she walked out of the locker room, leaving the two men exchanging uneasy glances. The incident in the range. Later that week, Naomi found herself scheduled for a routine firearms training session alongside Rourke and Hayes. It was standard procedure, mandatory practice to keep officers sharp and ensure their accuracy was up to par. But Naomi had a plan. The shooting range was cold and sterile, the sound of gunfire echoing off the concrete walls. Each officer stood in their designated lane, aiming at paper targets that swayed slightly with the air currents. Rourke, as always, couldn't resist making comments. "Careful there, Carter," he said loudly, smirking as he loaded his magazine. "Don't want you accidentally shooting yourself." Hayes snickered, chiming in, "Or someone else." Naomi ignored them, focusing on her weapon. She knew their type, arrogant, careless, always pushing boundaries because they assumed no one would push back. But today they would learn that assumptions could be dangerous. As the session progressed, Naomi noticed Rourke growing increasingly cocky, showing off his rapid-fire skills to anyone who would watch. Hayes joined in, their laughter grating on everyone else in the room. But Naomi waited. She bided her time until Rourke switched to a new weapon, a high-powered rifle that required careful handling. He wasn't paying attention, too busy boasting to Hayes about his accuracy. And that was when Naomi made her move. She approached Rourke under the guise of adjusting her gear. As she walked past him, she accidentally brushed against his elbow just as he was raising the rifle to aim. The motion was subtle, but the result was immediate. The rifle jerked in Rourke's hands, and the sharp recoil caused the weapon's edge to graze against his forearm, slicing through the fabric of his sleeve and leaving a shallow but painful cut. "Ah, shit!" Rourke yelled, dropping the rifle and clutching his arm as blood seeped through the tear in his uniform. "Rourke!" Hayes exclaimed, rushing to his side. "What the hell happened?" Naomi feigned concern, stepping back with wide eyes. "Oh my God, are you okay? I didn't mean to bump into you, I was just adjusting my vest." Rourke glared at her, his face pale with pain and anger. It was an accident," Naomi interrupted, her voice steady but laced with just enough innocence to disarm any suspicion. The range instructor hurried over, assessing the situation. "What's going on here?" Naomi quickly explained, her tone apologetic. "I must have accidentally nudged him while he was lining up his shot. I feel awful. It wasn't intentional." The instructor frowned but nodded. "All right, let's get this cleaned up. Rourke, go to the medic and have that looked at. Hayes, help him." As the two men left, Rourke shot Naomi a look that could have melted steel, but she simply stared back, her expression calm and unreadable, because she knew he couldn't prove anything, and that was the beauty of it. The fight in the garage. The tension in the precinct had reached a boiling point by the time Naomi's next encounter unfolded. It was late one evening, the station's underground parking garage dimly lit and eerily quiet. Naomi had just finished her shift and was heading to her car when she heard the sound of footsteps echoing behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Hey, Carter!" Hayes called out, his voice carrying through the cavernous space. Naomi stopped, her hand resting on the handle of her car door. She turned slowly, her expression neutral. "What do you want, Hayes?" He smirked, stepping closer. "Just wanted to chat. You've been different lately. Thought we should clear the air." Behind him, Rourke emerged from the shadows, his arm still bandaged from the range incident. His eyes burned with barely contained rage. "Yeah," Rourke added, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Let's clear the air." Naomi's grip on the car door tightened, but she didn't move. "You've got something to say. Say it." Rourke stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're clever, don't you? Making us look like idiots. But you're not untouchable, Carter. You're still just—" Before he could finish, Naomi moved. It happened so fast that Rourke didn't even have time to react. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them in an instant, and delivered a sharp, precise kick to the side of his knee. Rourke crumpled to the ground with a cry of pain, clutching his leg. Hayes lunged at her, but Naomi was ready. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. "Enough," she said, her voice cold and commanding. Hayes struggled, but Naomi tightened her grip, forcing him to still. "You think you can intimidate me?" she continued, her tone sharp as a blade. "You think you can scare me into submission?" She released Hayes with a shove, sending him stumbling forward. "You don't get to decide who I am," she said, her gaze burning into both men. "Not anymore." Rourke groaned from the ground, his pride shattered along with his knee. Hayes didn't dare make another move, his face pale with fear. Naomi stepped back, her posture relaxed but her presence undeniable. "Stay out of my way," she said simply, turning and walking to her car without another word. As she drove out of the garage, she glanced in her rearview mirror, watching the two men limp away in defeat. And for the first time in years, Naomi felt something she hadn't in a long time. Power. Chapter 4. Turning the tables. The atmosphere in the precinct had shifted drastically. Whispers followed Naomi wherever she went. Conversations would stop abruptly when she walked by, and colleagues who once mocked her now avoided her altogether. Those who dared to meet her gaze quickly looked away, as if afraid that eye contact alone could summon her wrath. Naomi had become an enigma, a woman who had quietly endured for years, but now exuded an unshakable confidence. The transformation was unnerving to those who had once ridiculed her, and unsettling to those who had turned a blind eye. But for Naomi, this was only the beginning. Uneasy alliances. Captain Walters, the precinct's commanding officer, had started to notice the tension brewing among his officers. While he wasn't fully aware of the details, it was impossible to ignore the growing divide. He called Naomi into his office one morning, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Carter," he began, motioning for her to sit. "I've been hearing some chatter about you lately." Naomi sat down, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "What kind of chatter, sir?" Walters leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on his desk. "You've had a string of incidents with some of your colleagues, Garrison, Rourke, Hayes. They're saying it's all coincidental, but let's be honest, there's a pattern." Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I didn't realize defending myself was against precinct policy." Walters raised an eyebrow. No one's accusing you of anything, not officially anyway. But whatever's going on, it's creating tension among the team." Naomi smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "With all due respect, sir, perhaps the tension isn't coming from me. Maybe it's coming from officers who are finally facing consequences for their actions." Walters studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Just be careful, Carter. This precinct runs on trust and teamwork. If that breaks down—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Naomi stood, her expression calm. "Understood, Captain." As she left his office, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. Walters might have been trying to warn her, but his words only confirmed what she already knew. Her plan was working. Setting another trap. Later that week, Naomi was assigned to patrol duty with Officer Bailey, a young rookie who had only been with the precinct for a few months. Bailey was nervous around Naomi, fidgeting in the passenger seat of their patrol car as they cruised through the quiet streets of their assigned district. "So," Bailey began hesitantly, "how long have you been with the force?" Naomi glanced at him briefly before answering. 7 years. Bailey nodded, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. "That's impressive. You must have seen a lot." "I have," Naomi replied simply, her tone giving nothing away. The conversation trailed off, and the car was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Bailey shifted awkwardly, unsure of how to navigate the situation. He had heard the rumors about Naomi, the stories of her run-ins with Rourke, Hayes, and the others. He wasn't sure what to believe, but one thing was clear. Naomi was not someone to underestimate. The tension in the car was interrupted by a call over the radio. A suspected armed robbery was underway at a convenience store a few blocks away. Naomi responded immediately, her voice calm and steady as she confirmed their unit was en route. As they arrived on the scene, Naomi and Bailey exited the car, their weapons drawn. The store's glass door was shattered, and the faint sound of movement came from inside. Naomi gestured for Bailey to stay close, her movements precise and confident as they entered the store. The suspect, a wiry man in a ski mask, was rummaging through the cash register. He froze when he saw the officers, his hands darting toward his waistband. "Don't!" Naomi said sharply, her weapon trained on him. "Hands where I can see them!" The suspect hesitated, his eyes darting between Naomi and Bailey. Then, in a split second, he pulled a handgun from his waistband and aimed it at Naomi. What happened next was a blur. Naomi fired first, her shot striking the suspect's shoulder and causing him to drop his weapon. Bailey stumbled back, his own gun trembling in his hands as the suspect collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain. Naomi approached cautiously, kicking the suspect's weapon away before handcuffing him. Bailey stared in shock, his face pale as he struggled to process what had just happened. "You okay?" Naomi asked, her voice steady as she secured the suspect. Bailey nodded shakily, lowering his weapon. "Yeah, I didn't expect—" "Stay focused," Naomi interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "We're not done yet." As they escorted the suspect to the patrol car, Naomi couldn't help but notice the way Bailey kept glancing at her, his expression a mix of awe and fear, a whisper campaign. The aftermath of the robbery only added to Naomi's growing reputation. News of her calm and decisive actions spread quickly through the precinct, solidifying her status as someone not to be trifled with. But not everyone was impressed. In the break room, Rourke and Hayes sat together, their voices low as they plotted their next move. "She's making us look bad," Rourke muttered, his tone bitter. "First Garrison, then me, and now this rookie's singing her praises. She's playing everyone." Hayes nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to shut her down, make her slip up." "Yeah," Rourke agreed, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "Let's see how perfect she really is." A nighttime stakeout. Naomi's next assignment was a late-night stakeout with Rourke and Hayes, a fact that didn't escape her notice. She knew they had requested to be paired with her, and she had no doubt they were planning something. As the three officers sat in a surveillance van, the tension was palpable. Rourke and Hayes exchanged smug glances, their whispers barely audible as they plotted their scheme. Naomi pretended not to notice, focusing on the monitors in front of her. but her mind was racing, calculating her next move. The opportunity came when Rourke suggested they split up to cover more ground. Naomi agreed, keeping her expression neutral as she followed Hayes down a dark alley. "What are we even looking for?" Hayes asked, his tone mocking. Naomi didn't respond, her eyes scanning the shadows. She could feel Hayes watching her, his smirk practically radiating off him. "You know," he began, his voice low, "you've got quite the reputation now. Everyone's talking about you." Naomi stopped, turning to face him. "Is that so?" Hayes stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Yeah, but you know what they say about people who climb too high." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What do they say?" "They always fall," Hayes replied, his tone dripping with malice. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe, but not tonight." Before Hayes could respond, Naomi stepped forward, her movements swift and deliberate. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to make him wince, but not enough to injure him. "Let's get something straight," she said, her voice calm but deadly. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." Hayes tried to pull away, but Naomi's grip was unyielding. "If you want to play games, go ahead," she continued, "but remember, I play to win." With that, she released him, turning and walking back toward the van. Hayes stood frozen in place, his confidence shattered. Naomi didn't look back. She didn't need to. Chapter 5. A Silent Revenge. The precinct was quieter than usual the following day. Naomi's interaction with Hayes had already started to spread, whispered among officers in hushed tones. Hayes avoided eye contact with her completely, while Rourke's attempts to mask his growing unease were becoming more and more obvious. Naomi, however, carried on as though nothing had changed. Her quiet confidence and calculated demeanor unnerved those who had once mocked her. What they didn't realize was that Naomi wasn't done, not by a long shot. An accident that wasn't a week later, Naomi found herself in the precinct's training gym, her scheduled partner none other than Rourke. It was a routine sparring session, a standard part of police training. But to Naomi it was an opportunity. Rourke's arrogance had only grown since his humiliation during the stakeout. He strutted around the gym, cracking jokes with his buddies as he stretched, his voice carrying across the room. "Hope you're ready for this, Carter," he said, smirking as he stepped onto the mat. "I'd hate to embarrass you in front of everyone." Naomi ignored him, adjusting the gloves on her hands as she stepped into position. The other officers gathered around the mat, their curious expressions betraying their eagerness to see the spectacle. Rourke wasted no time trying to dominate the match. He lunged at Naomi with a smug confidence, throwing quick but predictable punches. Naomi dodged effortlessly, her movements smooth and calculated. "Come on, Carter," Rourke taunted, circling her like a predator. "Show me what you've got." Naomi remained silent, her focus unshaken. When Rourke attempted another move, a clumsy attempt to pin her, she struck. In one fluid motion, Naomi dodged his grasp, swept his legs out from under him, and pinned him to the mat with a controlled but firm hold. The room erupted in murmurs as Rourke struggled against her grip, his face red with both exertion and embarrassment. "Yield," Naomi said calmly, her voice steady. Rourke gritted his teeth, refusing to answer. Naomi tightened her hold just enough to remind him who was in control. "Yield," she repeated, her tone unyielding. Finally, Rourke muttered, "Fine, I yield." Naomi released him and stood, her expression unreadable as she removed her gloves and stepped off the mat. The room was silent as the officers exchanged stunned glances. Even those who had once sided with Rourke seemed impressed, if not intimidated, by Naomi's quiet strength. As she left the gym, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. Another victory, another step closer to dismantling the toxic culture that had plagued the precinct for years. A gathering storm. Rourke's humiliation only added fuel to the growing tension within the precinct. Hayes, still reeling from his encounter with Naomi, was visibly on edge. The once cocky and loud-mouthed officer now avoided her entirely, his demeanor subdued. Meanwhile, Rourke's bruised ego refused to heal. He spent hours in the break room ranting to anyone who would listen, spinning the narrative to paint himself as the victim. "She got lucky, that's all," he muttered to a small group of officers. You think someone like her could actually take me in a real fight, please?" But his words fell flat. The other officers had seen what had happened firsthand, and their skepticism was evident. Naomi, on the other hand, stayed out of the fray. She continued her work with quiet determination, letting her actions speak louder than any words ever could. An unfortunate mishap. It wasn't long before another opportunity presented itself, this time during a routine weapons training exercise. The precinct had organized a session to practice handling and disassembling firearms, with Rourke assigned as the lead instructor. Naomi arrived early, taking her place at one of the tables lined with various weapons and tools. She noticed Rourke watching her, his smirk returning as he walked over. "Glad to see you're taking this seriously, Carter," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm. "Of course. Safety's important." The session began, and Rourke wasted no time using his position to try and undermine Naomi. He barked unnecessary instructions at her, pointed out minor mistakes that didn't exist, and made sarcastic comments under his breath. But Naomi remained unfazed. She followed his instructions to the letter, her movements precise and methodical. At one point, Rourke approached her table, leaning in close as he examined her work. "Careful with that blade, Carter," he said, referring to the tool she was using to disassemble the firearm. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Naomi's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Don't worry, I'm always careful." Moments later, as Rourke reached across her table to demonstrate a technique, Naomi accidentally nudged the blade just enough to nick his hand. Rourke jerked back with a sharp intake of breath, clutching his hand as a thin line of blood appeared. "Oops," Naomi said softly, her tone completely devoid of remorse. "Sorry about that. Guess I wasn't careful enough." The other officers glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Rourke glared at Naomi, his face a mixture of pain and fury. "You did that on purpose," he hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Naomi tilted her head, her expression innocent. "Why would I do that? You said it yourself. I need to be more careful." Before Rourke could respond, the session instructor walked over to check on the situation. "What happened?" the instructor asked, his brow furrowed. "Just a minor mishap," Naomi replied smoothly. "Nothing serious." The instructor glanced at Rourke's hand before nodding. "All right, everyone, let's get back to it." As the session continued, Rourke seethed silently, his wounded pride stinging far more than the cut on his hand. The last straw by now, the precinct was buzzing with rumors and speculation. Naomi's name was on everyone's lips, and her reputation as a force to be reckoned with was cemented. But for Rourke, Hayes, and their dwindling circle of supporters, the humiliation was too much to bear. They began plotting more aggressively, determined to regain control of the narrative and put Naomi in her place. What they didn't realize was that Naomi was always one step ahead. She had spent months observing their behavior, learning their weaknesses, and anticipating their moves. And now she was ready to deliver the final blow. The storm was coming, and Naomi was at the center of it, calm, focused, and utterly unstoppable. Chapter 6. The tides turn. The tension in the precinct reached a boiling point. Naomi's silent defiance and calculated moves had left her tormentors on edge, their grip on their dominance slipping away day by day. Rourke, Hayes, and their dwindling allies were desperate to regain control. But Naomi had anticipated their desperation, and her plan was already in motion. A shot in the dark. One evening, the precinct organized a live-fire training exercise at the outdoor shooting range. It was mandatory for all officers, a routine part of their training to keep their skills sharp. Naomi arrived early, ensuring she was paired with a group that included both Rourke and Hayes. The air was crisp, the setting sun casting long shadows over the range. Officers lined up in their respective groups, loading their weapons and preparing for the exercise. Naomi stood at her station, her face calm, but her eyes sharp, watching Rourke and Hayes from the corner of her eye. The drill began. Targets were set up at various distances, and officers were instructed to move through the range, firing at each target as they advanced. Naomi moved methodically, hitting her marks with precision. She could feel Hayes watching her, his smirk barely concealed as he leaned toward Rourke, whispering something she couldn't hear. As the exercise progressed, Naomi noticed an opportunity. Hayes was stationed a few positions ahead of her, his arrogance on full display as he barked orders to a rookie officer beside him. Naomi waited until he stepped slightly out of line, his focus on the rookie instead of his own target. The next shot Naomi fired was deliberate, her aim precise but subtle. The bullet grazed a metal plate near Hayes, sending sparks flying. He jumped back in alarm, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm as he looked around in confusion. "What the hell was that?" Hayes barked, glaring at the officers around him. "Relax, Hayes," Naomi called out, her tone calm but tinged with mock concern. "Probably just a ricochet. You know how unpredictable these drills can be." Hayes shot her a venomous look but said nothing, his face red with embarrassment as the other officers stifled chuckles. Naomi returned to her station, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. A new target. After the training exercise, Naomi's actions became the topic of hushed conversations among the officers. Those who had once dismissed her now watched her with a mix of respect and caution. Even the higher-ups began to take notice, though they were careful not to draw too much attention to her growing reputation. But Naomi wasn't done. She knew that Rourke and Hayes wouldn't let the incident at the range slide. Their egos wouldn't allow it. And as she expected, they began to scheme. One afternoon, Naomi overheard them talking in the locker room. She stayed out of sight, listening intently as Rourke's voice echoed off the walls. "She's getting too comfortable," Rourke muttered. "We need to remind her who's in charge." Hayes laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "I've got an idea. Let's see how she handles a little accident in the field." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. Their plan didn't surprise her, but it solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every officer who had ever been silenced, belittled, or humiliated. The trap is set. The opportunity for Rourke and Hayes to execute their plan came during a routine patrol. Naomi was assigned to join them on a call to investigate a reported disturbance in a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The call seemed ordinary, but Naomi knew better. As they approached the warehouse, Naomi noticed the tension in the air. Rourke and Hayes exchanged glances, their movements overly casual as they discussed the situation. "You take point, Carter," Rourke said, his tone laced with mock authority. "Let's see what you've got." Naomi nodded, her expression neutral as she led the way into the dimly lit building. The sound of their boots echoed against the concrete floor, the air heavy with the scent of dust and oil. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Rourke and Hayes fell behind, their whispers barely audible. Naomi pretended not to notice, her focus on the task at hand. She knew they were setting her up, but she also knew how to turn the tables. When they reached the back of the warehouse, Hayes motioned toward a stack of crates. "Check that out, Carter. Might be something suspicious." Naomi approached the crates cautiously, her hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. As she turned the corner, she heard the unmistakable sound of movement behind her. In an instant she pivoted, her weapon drawn. Rourke and Hayes stood a few feet away, their weapons raised, but their expressions betraying their uncertainty. "Drop your weapon, Carter," Rourke said, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously. Naomi didn't move. "What's the plan here, gentlemen? Shoot me and call it self-defense? Or were you hoping I'd make it easy for you?" Hayes smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're paranoid, Carter. We're just doing our jobs." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "Funny, because from where I'm standing it looks like you're about to cross a line you can't uncross." For a moment, the tension was suffocating. Then, in a calculated move, Naomi lowered her weapon slightly, just enough to ease their nerves. But her next words cut through the silence like a knife. "You think no one's watching? Think again." Rourke's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Naomi's lips curled into a faint smile. "The body cams. They've been on this whole time." Hayes froze, his face draining of color. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Naomi tilted her head, her calm demeanor unnerving them further. "Go ahead. Check your footage." Rourke hesitated, his hand hovering over the button on his vest. When he finally pressed it, his expression shifted from confusion to panic. The red light on his body cam blinked steadily, indicating it had been recording all along. Naomi's smile widened. "Guess the accident didn't go as planned, huh?" The beginning of the end. Rourke and Hayes were left speechless as Naomi stepped past them, her confidence unwavering. She had turned their trap into her own, exposing their intentions without firing a single shot. Back at the precinct, Naomi filed a detailed report of the incident, attaching the body cam footage as evidence. The higher-ups had no choice but to take action, and within days, Rourke and Hayes were placed under investigation. Naomi's actions sent shockwaves through the precinct. Those who had once dismissed her now looked at her with newfound respect and fear. The tide had turned, and Naomi was no longer the target of their ridicule. She was a force to be reckoned with, a silent storm that no one could ignore. But Naomi wasn't satisfied with just surviving. She wanted to ensure that no one else would endure what she had faced. And as the precinct began to reckon with the fallout of her actions, Naomi prepared for the next phase of her plan. Chapter 7. The hunters become the hunted. The walls were closing in on Rourke and Hayes. Naomi's strategic moves had dismantled their carefully constructed illusion of control, and the precinct was no longer their playground. The body cam footage had sparked an internal investigation, and whispers filled the halls. Officers who once turned a blind eye to their behavior were now keeping their distance. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. But Naomi wasn't done yet. She had learned that predators don't stop until they feel the full weight of their own fear. And Naomi was about to teach them what it meant to be hunted. The last straw. The precinct was quieter than usual. Conversations died the moment Naomi entered a room. She didn't care. Let them talk. Let them wonder what she'd do next. She passed a group of officers in the hallway, some who had mocked her before. Now they gave her nods of acknowledgement. Some even averted their eyes, no longer laughing at her weight, her background, or her presence. But not Rourke and Hayes. Despite the walls closing in, they refused to admit defeat. Naomi knew men like them. Their pride would never let them believe they were losing to someone like her. She saw them near the lockers, their conversation hushed, but their body language tense. Hayes looked rattled, while Rourke's jaw was clenched tight, his mind working overtime to figure a way out. She approached, slow and deliberate, making sure they saw her before she spoke. "Something wrong, boys?" she asked, her voice dripping with amusement. Hayes's hand twitched at his side, but he said nothing. Rourke, ever the arrogant one, forced a smirk. "Enjoying your little victory?" he sneered. "You think this is over?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "It is for you." Rourke stepped forward, dropping his voice to a low growl. "You don't belong here. You never did." Naomi didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, holding his gaze with an unreadable expression. "How you keep telling yourself that?" she finally said, turning on her heel and walking away. She could feel their rage boiling behind her. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. The incident that night, Naomi found herself on another call, this time a domestic dispute in one of the more dangerous neighborhoods. She had a bad feeling about it the moment she stepped into the patrol car. Something felt off. She was assigned to respond with Hayes. Rourke had been benched due to the investigation, but Naomi could feel his fingerprints all over this. As they arrived at the scene, Naomi noticed how conveniently the area was cleared out. No witnesses, no backup. A trap. Hayes stepped out first, keeping his hand near his gun. Naomi followed, her own instinct screaming at her to be ready. Inside the dimly lit house, the air was thick with tension. The argument they had been called for had long since ended. No one was there. Hayes turned toward her, and that's when she saw it. The flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the slight shift of weight in his stance. "Drop your gun," he ordered, his voice forced, like he was trying to convince himself this was the right move. Naomi exhaled slowly. "Really, Hayes? You think this is how it ends?" He pulled his gun, aiming it at her. His hands trembled. "This wasn't my idea," he muttered. Rourke said we had to handle it before you ruin us." Naomi stared at him, her mind working fast. Hayes was scared. He wasn't like Rourke, he was weak, a follower, not a leader, and that was his weakness. She took a small step forward, forcing him to adjust his aim. "You're not going to do it," she said simply. "Shut up," Hayes snapped. "You don't have the stomach for it," she continued. "You're just doing what Rourke tells you, but guess what, Hayes? Rourke isn't here." His grip faltered. He said, "You're on your own," she interrupted. "And I already made sure people know where I am." His face paled. "Think about it," she pressed. "You shoot me, you're done. You don't shoot me, Rourke will take you down himself." Hayes's breathing was ragged now. His eyes darted to the door, to the gun in his hands, to the floor, everywhere but her face. "You want to know what Rourke's doing right now?" Naomi asked, her voice low, calculated. "He's planning his next move, and you're just another pawn. Do you really think he's going to take the fall with you?" Hayes's hands shook violently. He was crumbling. Naomi took one last step forward. "Or you can put that gun down," she said, "and we both walk out of here alive." The silence stretched between them. Then, clank. The gun hit the floor. Hayes staggered back, his whole body trembling. Naomi wasted no time. She picked up his weapon and secured it, her own gun still trained on him. "You made the right choice," she murmured. Hayes collapsed onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. Naomi pulled out her radio. "Dispatch, we have an officer in distress, requesting immediate backup." Hayes didn't even protest. The aftermath. The fallout was immediate. Hayes was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Rourke? The moment he heard what had happened, he knew he had lost. Hayes had crumbled. Naomi had outplayed them at every turn. And now, the department was watching him closely. Naomi walked into the precinct the next morning like nothing had happened. Officers glanced at her, some with curiosity, some with admiration, and others with fear. She had done the impossible. She had flipped the script. The final move that afternoon, Naomi received an unexpected visitor. Captain Monroe, the precinct's commanding officer, motioned for her to follow him to his office. She sat across from him, her posture relaxed, but her mind on high alert. "I read your report," Monroe said, leaning back in his chair. "I also reviewed the body cam footage, and I have to admit, what you did was impressive." Naomi said nothing. Monroe exhaled slowly. "We can't have officers like Rourke in this department. We're launching a full investigation into his actions. If we find enough evidence, he's gone." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "You don't need me to tell you what you already know." Monroe chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I don't." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You ever thought about moving up? I could use someone like you in leadership." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You offering me a promotion?" Monroe smirked. "Let's just say, doors are opening." Naomi let the silence stretch before finally responding. "I'll think about it." Monroe nodded. "Take your time." As Naomi left his office, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just victory, control. She had spent years enduring humiliation, cruelty, and abuse, but she had fought back, not with rage, not with recklessness, but with precision. And now they all knew. She wasn't the woman they could laugh at anymore. She was the one they feared. Chapter 8. The Power Shift. Naomi had changed the rules of the game. No longer the target of whispered jokes and backhanded remarks, she walked through the precinct with her head high, her presence a quiet but undeniable force. The air around her had shifted. Officers who once mocked her now lowered their voices when she passed. Some even nodded in silent acknowledgement. But it wasn't just about respect, it was about fear. They had seen what happened to those who underestimated her. They had watched as she took down men who thought they were untouchable. And now none of them wanted to be next. The fall of Rourke. The day Rourke was finally suspended, Naomi sat in her patrol car sipping her coffee as she read the department-wide email. Effective immediately, Sergeant Rourke is placed on indefinite suspension, pending further investigation. She smirked. It wasn't enough, not yet. But it was the beginning of the end for him. Inside the precinct, Rourke was a ghost. His usual arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet, seething anger. Hayes had crumbled under pressure, and now Rourke was left alone to face the consequences. He had tried to play the system, but Naomi had learned the system better than he ever could, and she had beaten him at his own game. She caught his eye from across the room. He stared at her, something dark and unspoken passing between them. A final standoff. Naomi simply took another sip of her coffee and turned away. It was over. A new beginning. With Rourke out of the picture, Naomi's world changed. No more harassment, no more humiliation, no more looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next cruel joke, the next inappropriate touch, the next accidental shove in the training room. She had won. But winning wasn't just about survival. It was about creating something better. When Captain Monroe called her into his office again, this time the offer was official. "Sergeant Hayes is resigning," he said, watching her carefully, "and we need strong leadership in his place." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Is that so?" Monroe smirked. "What do you say, Officer Johnson? Ready to move up?" She let the silence stretch. For years, she had fought just to be seen. Now, they were offering her power. Not because they pitied her, because they respected her. And respect, that was earned. Naomi finally nodded. "I'm in." The last laugh. The first day as sergeant, Naomi took her time settling into her new office. A real desk, a real nameplate, a real seat at the table. She leaned back in her chair, enjoying the moment. Then a knock at the door. She already knew who it was. Monroe opened it slightly, peeking inside. "Thought you'd want to know. Rourke cleaned out his locker today. He didn't say much, just walked out without looking back." Naomi smiled. "Guess he finally figured out he lost." Monroe chuckled. "Guess so." As the door closed, Naomi exhaled, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. The battle was over. The war had been won. And the best part? She never had to throw the first punch. She let them destroy themselves. That was real power. The message that matters to everyone watching this: let this be a lesson. You don't have to be the strongest. You don't have to be the fastest. You don't have to be what they expect you to be. You just have to be smart, because in the end, the real winners aren't the ones who scream the loudest. They're the ones who know exactly when to strike. If you made it to the end of this story, I have one question for you. Have you ever had to fight back in a way nobody saw coming? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if this video made you feel anything, anger, pride, or even just the thrill of watching the underdog win, hit that like button right now. Because these stories, they matter. And if you want more, subscribe. Because we're not done yet, not even close. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.